Awesome sauce. Okay. This is part one of our new book club. I don't have a name for it. Either way, the book we are reading, the first 30 pages, is The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist, chosen by Cyril. Great choice. So yeah, we read the first 30 pages, which is happened to be the intro and chapter one, which personally I was super surprised about because the intro, when I did it on audiobook the first time, took me months. Whereas reading through it now took me like 2 days. So I suppose we can go around and do some screenshots. Like I said, I have five, but I'll only bring them up if we kind of run out of screenshots. In the meantime, Cyril, do you have a screenshot that you want to present since it was your pick? You can either do something that was confusing or favorite, or you pick.
To be honest, I am very much confused by everything that was said in that first chapter and intro. So yeah, just like I'm confused about everything. And then kind of the interesting thing, I guess, that came up was that I think the left hemisphere is bigger like in the front, and the right hemisphere is bigger in the back. That's, I guess, an interesting thing that came to mind.
Yeah, I think I took screenshots of the diagrams because it being a part of the intro, he doesn't necessarily get into why just yet. So I feel like we get all these cliffhangers and just little pieces before he actually gets into the explanation of it.
That comes later on. I think it's mainly just there's asymmetry in the brain.
He's dispelling myths. That's his primary function of the introduction. Let you know the journey that you're going on, how he's going to present the evidence, and then to let you know that basically everything that you've been told about the brain in any type of mainstream format is entirely incorrect. And then he puts together his nomeological evidence to demonstrate this, and then sets the challenge. But that's the overarching sediment of the introduction.
Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I can see that.
Page 3.
Yeah, part of the introduction was a bunch of categories like the structure of this book, why the structure of the brain is important. And this one I particularly liked. This is one of my favorites of the intro, just because as an artist, whenever you are even we're talking about creating a logo for this new YouTube channel, and symbolism and metaphor is everything. And him taking this book, which you require the left hemisphere in order to structure it, right, and actually create it, he's still, like an artist, divided into two parts to match the brain of which it is about. And I thought that was pure gold. This book is divided, like the brain it describes, into two parts. In part one, I will focus on the brain itself and what it can tell us. I will look at the evolution of the brain, its divided and asymmetrical nature, the implications of the development of music and language, and what we know about what goes on in each side of the brain. What it is they do that is so different. Well, I will argue nothing much. It is quite true that almost everything we once thought went on in one or the other hemisphere alone is now known to go on in both. So where does that leave the pursuit of hemisphere differences? Right on track. The whole problem is that we are obsessed, because of what I argue is our affiliation to left hemisphere modes of thought, with what the brain does. After all, isn't the brain a machine? And like any machine, the value of it lies in what it does. I happen to think this machine model gets us only some of the way, and like a train that drops one in the middle of the night far from one's destination, a train of thought that gets one only some of the way is a liability. The difference, I shall argue, is not in the what, but in the how. By which I don't mean the means by which, machine model again, but the manner in which, something no one ever asked of a machine.
What about that resonated with you?
Like I alluded to earlier, the fact that he said he took the book and divided it like the brain, which is the topic of the book. It, as somebody who he loves poetry, And that was to me very poetic. It was just an artistic choice as somebody who's also an academic author. So that resonated. And then, yeah, the explanation between what and how, just addressing some of the preconceptions that he knew people would walk in with when first reading the book. Did anybody feel like they had preconceptions that he addressed through the intro, since everybody's read the intro here?
It definitely was interesting because, at least so far that I've read, it's he acknowledges that there is this myth to pop culture garbage that's kind of saying, oh, left brain is your is or whatever. It's like one's artsy fartsy and the other is math, and that kind of thing that people kind of just that's the first thing they come up with. But it was interesting because he disproved it to a degree, but still acknowledged that there is a difference, but it's almost not empirically, it's not empirically measurable. Just like there's some other things I've learned from Iain, or from Mr. McGilchrist. Within the mind, it's not measurable. It's not mathematic. You kind of can't take it from a mathematical perspective. So that was really interesting to me, because I feel like I look at things really logically, where there's logic to it, but it's more of, like he was saying, you can't approach it from that machine of, how does it work? What does it do? It is like, in what manner does it? I thought that was an interesting take.
Yeah, that's very true. I think from what stood out to me about that one that you read, Maddie, is that the difference isn't so much in function, it's more in the approach. Like, both hemispheres basically do the same things, but they have a different way of viewing, and they almost act to inhibit each other in a sense through the corpus callosum, which is also in the introduction. But yeah, people, I think they get the idea that there's each area of the brain has different interests, and I guess to an extent they do, but it's more on the approach rather than any other variation. That's where the difference comes in.
Yeah, it's interesting. When he was talking about the hemispheres, he mentioned that they play a role in differentiating themselves. And he kind of talked about how with their evolution, it's almost like they don't take away anything, but they kind of add on to each other according to what is happening. It's a bit of a responsive kind of dynamic, but to me, like that's it sounds like an evolution, and I believe there was a paragraph in there that I've probably screenshotted, but it was like an evolution where it's kind of just like it's not necessarily like one does this over the other, and at the same time it's also like one does this over the other, because they have different ways of viewing what it is that needs to be done.
It's like Noah's question in the chat there: is there a difference or is there not a difference? And the answer to that is yes. Like you guys often say, it's a kind of dependent on your mode of attention too. It's like a man and a woman, for example. There's no difference if you consider their dignity as human beings, but there is a difference if you consider their roles and inclinations and responsibilities and their ways of viewing the world. I think it's the same thing here. It's different in some ways, like the mode of attention again. It's not different in that they both handle everything all at the same time.
If I could share the screen, actually, I had a few thoughts. I thought it was fairly interesting here. Yeah, I thought this. Okay. I'm not sure if you guys can see this. Okay.
Yeah. This
I
is one of my
interesting.
screenshots.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I actually did. I took like 5 screenshots just of the intro. But it's interesting because I guess I'll just give my thoughts of it, and then we can go into it a bit more. But he kind of contrasts he talks about what we've learned in the dichotomy of things, and he mentions in here naive realism or scientific materialism versus idealism, postmodernism. So it's like that dumps into metaphysics, where things are is observable reality, is it something outside of ourselves, or is it created by what we observe and it's just an illusion? And that what's been plaguing philosophers for centuries. It's like, and philosopher comes derived from the word lover of truth. So it's like, what is there an external powers at work, which is interesting. So I'll just start at the beginning here and then we can go through it. But it's interesting because it says, he says, things change according to the stance we adopt towards them, the type of attention we pay to them, the disposition we hold in relation to them. This is important because the most fundamental difference between the hemispheres lies in the type of attention that they give to the world. So that's an interesting part right there. But it's also important because of the widespread assumption in some quarters that there are two alternatives. Either things exist out there, in quotations, and are unaltered by the machinery we use to dig them up or to tear them apart, naive realism or scientific materialism, or they're subjective phenomena which we create out of our own minds, so more relativism kind of thing, and therefore we are free to treat them in any way we wish, since they are, after all, our own creations. Naive idealism, postmodernism. These positions are not by any means as far apart as they look, and a certain lack of respect is evident in both. In fact, I believe there's something that exists apart from ourselves, but that we play a vital part in bringing it into being. The central theme of this book is the importance of our disposition towards the world and one another as being fundamental and grounding what is that we come to have a relationship with, rather than the other way around. And then he goes on to say, the kind of attention we pay actually alters the world. We are literally partners in creation. So I wondered what your guys' thoughts are on that, because he doesn't give his opinion. He comes up from the scientific standpoint of, these are accepted theories, but they're not necessarily one or the other. But he's saying there's each theory kind of have its own part to play. So I wonder what you thought on that, and that idea of how the brain, observable reality, and that kind of stuff.
If I had any questions at all, it would be, is he incorporating both of those ideas, or is he rejecting both of them? Because to me, it seems like more of a rejection of both. And he's finding a third way. He's not combining postmodernism with a machine model, so to speak. He's finding something else, like taking everything into context and understanding that there is an objective truth, but we understand it in context.
He's acknowledging that there is a higher kind of a coalescing, I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of like a higher purpose to things, or maybe a order, but he doesn't at least in here he doesn't divulge that, but it's very, really interesting.
Well, with the objectivism argument of something either apart from yourself or if it's just entirely in your own head, I think what he's trying to get at is that you play a part in what it is that you think is external from yourself. It can't be, because you're interacting with it. So how can it be just external from you when you're a part of that interaction in the first place? And then it's not entirely in your head, because how did it get in your head if there wasn't other things around you to engage with? So hence why it's a relationship. And I think that that's why he was talking so much about mode of attention, and why that's so important is because he said that it plays a part in how you shape the world. And then I actually have something that's a screenshot that can actually kind of answer that, because it's talking a bit about objectivity and subjectivity. And actually, it's near the very end of the first chapter that I can just read it, and then we can kind of go into it, because I think that this plays into it, where he says, okay, so a bit of context. He's talking about how you can never step into the same river twice. And actually, since it's at the very end, I could probably just pull it up in the book.
Could you get us a page number, Macy, so we can follow along?
Sure. So this is page 30 and 31.
Okay.
Okay, so he says, this is going to be a little long, so bear with me. But he says, experience is forever in motion, ramifying and unpredictable. In order for us to know anything at all, that thing must have enduring properties. If all things flow and one can never step into the same river twice, Heraclides' phrase is, I believe, a brilliant evocation of the core reality of the right hemisphere's world. One will always be taken unawares by experience, since nothing being ever repeated, nothing can ever be known. We have to find a way of fixing it as it flies, stepping back from the immediacy of experience, stepping outside the flow. Hence, the brain has to attend to the world in two completely different ways, and in so doing, to bring two different worlds into being. In the one, we experience the live, complex, embodied world of individual, always unique beings, forever in flux, a net of interdependencies, forming and reforming wholes, a world with which we are deeply connected. In the other, we experience our experience in a special way, a represented version of it, containing now static, separable, bounded, but essentially fragmented entities grouped into classes on which predictions can be based. This kind of attention isolates, fixes, and makes each thing explicit by bringing it under the spotlight of attention. In doing so, it renders things inert, mechanical, lifeless. But it also enables us for the first time to know, and consequently to learn and to make things. This gives us power. These two aspects of the world are not symmetrically opposed. They are not equivalent, for example, to the subjective and objective points of view, concepts which are themselves a product of and already reflect one particular way of being in the world, which in fact, importantly, already reflect a view of the world. The distinction I'm trying to make is between, on the one hand, the way in which we experience the world pre-reflectively, before we had a chance to view it at all, or divide it up into bits, a world in which what later has come to be thought of as subjective and objective are held in a suspension which embraces each potential pole and their togetherness together. And on the other hand, the world we are more used to thinking of, in which subjective and objective appear as separate poles. At its simplest, a world where there is betweenness, and one where there is not. These are not different ways of thinking about the world. They are different ways of being in the world. And their differences is not symmetrical, but fundamentally asymmetrical. Yeah, well, so when he's talking about this, like, he's talking about more so the right hemisphere kind of versus left hemisphere in terms of their ways of attending to things. So when he's talking about it in terms of you're part of this process called life, and I think that it addresses more so that the right hemisphere instinctively knows this and is connected with whatever is surrounding itself, because that just so happens to be like that's what we're surrounded with. And it knows also instinctively how your mind, I don't know if necessarily works as a stasis, but it works as a process. And I think when he's talking about the river analogy, it's like you're part of this thing and you can never step into the same river twice because it's always moving. But when you decide to step out and take it back with a focused, narrow-sighted attention, that is the realm of the left hemisphere, in order for you to come to know anything. And I think that that's how we come to do differentiation, because he even mentioned in the book as well, where the right hemisphere deals with more distinction, and the left hemisphere deals with more categorization. So it's almost like the right hemisphere can see things more on their own individuality, whereas the left kind of like conglomerates and puts things in a box type of thing. So, and all of this has to do with your mode of attention. And in the first chapter, he's kind of talking about why is that the case? And he thinks it's because he thinks that there's two hemispheres, like why two? And he thinks that it's because, and why a corpus callosum that decides that it's going to inhibit their communication instead of help each other. And he said that one aspect could be because there's two different ways that we need to attend to the world simultaneously. So in the first chapter, he uses the analogy of a bird that has to peck out a seed in a pile of pebbles, and another mode of attention where it needs to look out for predators. So it needs to look out for itself and feed itself and all these very just narrow-minded things that need to be done, but it also needs to take into context everything else that's surrounding it, because it could die if it doesn't do this thing either. And so he's trying to say that human beings are kind of the same way, where we have to look out for me, but we have to also look out for me in context to everything that's surrounding me. So that's what I got from that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry if I could just jump in here. This is kind of off topic, but could you guys see the drawing that I made by accident when Jeremiah was presenting?
Yes.
I did see that.
Okay, so
I did not.
kind of just
Should
an
I have?
idea.
Can you send it
What
to
if
me?
one person just screen shared the PDF, and then the person that wanted to talk about something would call out a specific page. The person could scroll to that page, and then that person, when someone's screen sharing, just above your mute button, there is annotate button, and that they could highlight the area they want to see, they want to talk about, or talk about the specific thing. So you don't have to be like, oh, I don't have a screenshot for this, but I want to talk about it. You can just pull up the page. I don't know if that's a worthwhile idea or no.
Sure, that sounds a good idea.
Yeah.
Emissary, just have a question for you. You were mentioning that you were talking about, what we come to know, that incorporation of knowledge, at least from what I'm getting from that last page. It's kind of talking about knowledge and taking in your surroundings. He mentions earlier talking about, at least in the intro, from what I can tell, he says, it's more of a question he's asking, and he's saying, well, what do the emotions have to do with anything, and are they purely mechanical in there? Are they useful, or are they like just purely kind of instinctual? And I'm wondering, does that have anything in your opinion? Do you think that emotions have anything to do with coming knowledge or recognizing reality, or even the observance of reality, or mostly knowledge? But what do you think about that?
I think your question is confusing me a little bit. Can you rephrase that a bit better?
I guess do emotions have anything to do with, it is said that this, I don't know if it's universal, but it's said that within the soul there's the mind, will, and the emotions. Do you think the emotions kind of bounce back and forth with the mind?
I would say that insofar as your emotions change the way in which you're attending to the world around you, it'll alter how you come to know and experience things. So if you come to a place and you're in an angry place in your mind, you're going to come to different conclusions and different ways of experiencing that moment than if you came to it in a stable, happy, or contented, or philosophical way of thinking. And so, yeah, they affect it because it's just you have emotions. It's your reality. It's part of what you are as a creature. So how you come to know anything, you have to go through the experience through the lens of what you actually are as a human being with emotions and a mind.
We talk about having intellect, will, and passions like they're three separate things, but really you can't separate them. They're not interchangeable, but they're interconnected.
Yeah, I was about to say,
anything that happens with one is happening with the other. You experience it all as one thing. It's not three
yeah, because
separate.
emotions don't live apart from the brain. They are also expressed within the brain. So they're expressed within the brain just as much as within your body. Like anger is usually the primary emotion of the left hemisphere, which we get to later, and he explains it more in depth, and because it's not that black and white. Whereas empathy, for example, an emotion, is more within the right hemisphere. So even certain emotions, like Kyle alluded to, will be a part of your attention to the world, as it's in the brain as well as the body. So you don't really separate brain from emotions. That's one of the dichotomies I think he tries to get rid of right off the bat, which you alluded to, Jeremiah, which was the logic versus emotionalism and logic versus creativity. It's not that simple. because both hemispheres have logic and creativity, but they have their own versions.
I can see there being some value in considering some of these things separately, like logic and creativity, like intellect, will, and passions, as long as you can keep in mind that they are all expressed as a unified whole, and you don't really have one without the other as part of the human experience.
Yeah, like you can isolate them to analyze and figure out the more finite details of them, but you have to return and recontextualize it if you want to understand it as a part of that whole.
That's
Yeah,
right.
like when it comes to understanding anything, I think that what was really important is even when you try the whole a scientific way of viewing things, like the detachment, that's still mode of attention. That's still some people make the mistake of attributing detachment as figuring out what is true and what is real. And it's terrible. I have the book right here, but I honestly cannot screen share, but I can do my best. This one's shorter, but again,
which page is it?
It's page 28.
Sure.
And it's the tiny third kind of paragraph when it starts with science. You can just pull
Here we
this
go.
up. Okay, so science, however, purports to be uncovering such a reality. Its apparently value-free descriptions are assumed to deliver the truth about the object onto which our feelings and desires are later painted. Yet this highly objective stance, this view from nowhere, to use Nigel's phrase, is itself value-laden. It is just one particular way of looking at things, a way which privileges detachment, a lack of commitment of the viewer to the object viewed. For some purposes, this can be undeniably useful, but its use in such causes does not make it truer or more real, closer to the nature of things. So this is when we're talking about the nature of attention section. And again, when he talked about this, he talks of different models of viewing the world, and this scientific lack of commitment to the viewer to the object viewed, this privileging of detachment, it's just another way of looking at things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any more or less truer. It's actually just a part of it. Hence, it's a particular perspective. It's a possibility. Because he was talking about it, and it's almost like there's more than one way to view a mountain. Because if anything, it's just above, like just a paragraph above this one, if you scroll. Yeah, so he says, a mountain that is a landmark to a navigator, a source of wealth to a prospector, a many-textured form to a painter, or to another the dwelling place of the gods, is changed by the attention given to it. There is no real mountain which can be distinguished from these, no one way of thinking which reveals the true mountain, because all of these ways of viewing this mountain are true. So I almost think about it, and this is a good little thingy, is truth relative? And I do think it is relative, because truth depends on context. It depends on parameters. And when you're talking about parameters, you're talking about your mode of attention. And does it make it any less true or false? Well, it's just a part of it. It's one particular way of looking at it.
Can you expand a bit more on what you mean when you say truth is relative? Are we talking that anything can be understood by anybody in any way? Or is it more like there is an objective thing that's understood in context in different ways by different people, depending on their mode of attention? Or is it something else altogether?
I think that its truth is in relation to. So when I say relative, I mean it's in relation to, as in whatever is going on. And so hence why when that in his mountain analogy kind of thing, yeah, I can come at it from different ways of looking at it. It's almost like the relationship, as he mentioned earlier, that I have with my friend versus one that I have with my employer. It's a different kind of circumstance, different context, but both ways of looking at these people, which is what you're engaging with, are still true. So I'd say that truth is in relation to, hence why I say relative, because truth is surrounded by context, and context is something that's changing, and you are something that's changing as well. So it's almost like truth is like a process.
Yeah, there's there's a screenshot that kind of covers that well. He says it multiple times in various ways because just like the nature of all existence, there's multiple ways to represent it. So therefore you need multiple metaphors, multiple analogies, multiple synonyms, and that is the only way to capture the whole, because the nature of books, words, is that they're static, they're finite. They're supposed to represent a singular thing, whereas life is not singular. And the way reality manifests, it's a process. So you always have to use multiple metaphors and words. So he repeats himself in different ways because that's the only way to portray the reality of what is doing it multiple times with various different explanations.
So yeah, it seems like what you're saying then is that it's not that truth is relative, it's a relational thing. It's not that there isn't an objective reality, but it's understood in relation and context with everything else.
Well, what is relation if not relative?
I mean, consider this. Try to live life consequence-free. You can ignore consequences, but you can't ignore the reality of the consequences that bear on you. So that's where when you get into the ideologues, the people that feel like, well, this is my truth, it's like it's an incorrect viewpoint as a whole, but it's not when the individual makes the statement, because it's the left hemisphere that makes that reduction so that it can grab reality and say, but this is the truth. And then that absolutism, it's not that it's incorrect. The problem is it's incomplete. And that's the part that that's why they get caught on relativism. You're actually getting subjugated to the word, because now you are starting to argue definitions of terms, and yet you have to argue definitions of terms because the minute that you use words to communicate with another person, you are in the midst of negotiating truth between two people. So you have a sense of absolutism because you've entered into the dialogue. But then you start getting into the terms, which the left hemisphere very much likes, and it's a system. And you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but this is why it's incomplete. And then when a consensus happens, a meta pattern emerges. And the meta pattern is when the community of individuals, which is more in the right hemisphere's wheelhouse, starts to go, well, then these patterns that allow us to exist in a productive manner where we're not worrying about the top 5 things that every human being, the left hemisphere, procuring food and water and, the things of the body. It's like, then that meta pattern becomes a truth. And then you actually hand it back to the left hemisphere for a moment. It goes, oh, so this pattern that everybody lived and negotiated with one another now becomes a truth. So they're not incorrect, but this is a meta pattern. Well, what if you're working with another community that's not a part of your community that has come up with a different meta pattern? Well, so it's been successful for those particular individuals. So they're going to feel very adamant that they have a truth. And then another group might be like, well, we haven't experienced this as a group, but it's not like it's an impossibility that there's some truth there. And so I think that that's the difference between relativism, the way you might get it in a university education right now, when you're going into philosophical debates about ideological mindsets between the diversity, exclusivity, inclusivity mantra, versus something that I would say like Carter's proposal about, okay, so we're talking a different type of relativism. And it's like, yes, that relation too, because it's in the betweenness of the hemispheres that your best balance for existing will manifest in relation to everything else around you and from within you. That's my 2 cents on that.
That's an interesting point you bring up, Mike. I like how you brought that up, how you kind of cleared up that you made that really good distinction. And I wonder if that's really interesting, considering how that plays into morality. And I would go as far to say is that, so you look at the moral injustices of the innumerable ideologies out there, and you say, well, that's wrong, that's not right. And then relativism would beg to differ in its, like you were saying, the universities and other people would, depending on who you're talking to, they would beg to differ. But I would go as far to say is that, it's based on that premise. They might look at something. It's kind of like that meme, two people are looking at a number, 6. One guy sees it one side, it says 9. The other guy sees 6. But I wonder if it's more of based on an incorrect premise. If there is a reality, and that it, like, I guess we all recognize that there is an objective truth, and yet some people acknowledge it and some refuse to acknowledge it. And that determines people's, from where they're coming from and where they develop their ethics from that, from their truth, from what, not their truth. It's not, there's no such thing, but what they observe as truth. So then you come to people like Joseph Stalin. He could be someone that says, he's, completely evil as hell. And yet, in his mind, survival of the fittest, and, I'm taking care of myself, I'm taking care of the people that are under me, and what is his observable reality and his truth that he's come to understand is not necessarily wrong in the world of relativism. And that's why I kind of argue against it in the pure sense of relativism, relative truth. But I do understand that there is a way that people understand it, but it's like they still have a choice to deny, at one point or another, they have to deny that premise of right versus wrong. And then wherever that premise comes from, there's a lot of agreement, disagreement. There's a lot of controversy, but
the philosophy side of that is that Stalin would have been problem solving under the left hemisphere's philosophy. This is like, wait till you guys get to the kicker. This is why, I'm working with going over this literature like 4 times, and I'm also well on my way into his next tomes. And I would like to expand a little bit on, it's not even either or, but yet it is, because you're capable of Stalin reasoning because you have a left hemisphere. And that is actually one of the things that a lot of people don't take into the equation. That's why Gilchrist's work is so close to this family's heart. There's a line in scriptures. I also happen to mess around with the Bible a lot in my life, but Paul, makes a statement that says, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. And this one statement, it has a lot of depth to it, because the left hemisphere will not only say, well, of course, everything's beneficial, because that's its primary function in the world, is to provide benefit for thyself. There's a line that says, do what thou will is the whole of the law, which is a satanic principle. And yet that lays in the philosophical perspective of the left hemisphere. You guys are early in this journey, so I'm very excited to watch and listen to you guys. But you will never escape this. And this is something, because everywhere you go, the one thing that everybody has in common, and people get perplexed and they're like, oh, I have a hard time fathoming why someone would do this, or why an individual would think that. And it's like they have a brain. Like, no matter what goes on, we all have a brain. So when you realize that you're actually rolling with 2 hemispheres that both have a capability of cooperatively working together as they should, but it doesn't mean that they will. And there's the factor of, that's why you get, I don't know if I'm not mistaken, the master and his emissary metaphor was used in the introduction, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And there's a reason why he uses this, because what you guys are about to figure out while you're even working about the truth and perspectives and relativism is that as you go along, you're going to come to the realization that you have an usurper within your own countenance, that you can't build an empire without a tape measure. And your left hemisphere is so necessary and so important, but it is not supposed to be the master, because all the other things that help make you that more well-balanced individual is right hemispheric modes of attention and philosophy. And so you're going to really love that. So a lot of these early questions that I'm hearing that are exciting to listen to. You guys are really going to enjoy it because these mysteries do get unraveled. He just wants to lay the groundwork of making sure that you understand what you are so you can better negotiate who you are.
Yeah, I have a screenshot that I'll pull up now, which is on exactly that. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Okay, so it starts off, thus the cortex, the outer shell that mediates most so-called higher functions of the brain, and certainly those of which we are conscious, arose out of the underlying subcortical structures which are concerned with biological regulation at an unconscious level. And the frontal lobes, the most recently evolved part of the neocortex, which occupy a much bigger part of the brain in humans than in our animal relatives, and which grow forwards from on the top of the rest of the cortex, mediate most of the sophisticated activities that mark us out as human. Planning, decision-making, perspective-taking, self-control, and so on. In other words, the structure of the brain reflects its history as an evolving dynamic system in which one part evolves out of and in response to another. I think we would accept that the conflicts that Freud helped identify between will and desire, between intention and action, and broader disjunctions between whole ways of conceiving the world in which we live, are the proper concern not just of psychiatrists and psychologists, but of philosophers and of artists of all kind and of each one of us in daily life. Similarly, understanding the way in which the brain structure influences the mind is of relevance not just to neuroscientists or psychiatrists or philosophers, but to everyone who has a mind or a brain. If it turns out that there is, after all, coherence to the way in which the correlates of our experience are grouped and organized in the brain, and we can see these functions forming intelligible wholes corresponding to areas of experience, and see how they relate to one another at the brain level, this casts some light on the structure and experience of our mental world. And in this sense, the brain is, in fact, it has to be a metaphor of the world. So that goes over what talked about knowing what you are to negotiate who you are. And everybody needs to know the brain because everybody has a brain. So you want to know how you operate in the world, how you can choose to operate in the world, because that's the big point is the brain learning the functions and structure is important to know the what you are. And then the how is choosing the mode of attention, the left versus the right hemisphere, each of which have their own needs in different circumstances, but however, one still over the other for majority of things, hence master and his emissary.
One thing I'm looking forward to discussing in the future is whether we think the brain is a mediator of consciousness or a cause of consciousness. And I don't think we've read quite far enough as a group to get to that question, but something to think about for the future anyway.
He did briefly mention that, and that was something I had to ponder a bit, because although he said he wasn't going to address the topic of consciousness, he still can't help but doing when you're talking about the brain and the body and life, you can't not address it. And even the distinction between the brain versus the mind.
Yeah.
That was something that I had to play with a little bit too. And I'm still kind of playing with it. Because as far as I understand it, consciousness is it's how the world ends up manifesting, really. As humans, we're conscious of the world, we're conscious of ourselves. The consciousness is just the way of which we experience the world, as far as I get it, rather than thinking of consciousness as this external thing that humans have. It's what we experience is consciousness, because if we are conscious, we can't escape that. We can't disembody ourselves. We can't do the objective thing. We're only going to see it in terms of our experience of the world. But it's a big topic. Yeah.
I guess there's certain people that have zero consciousness at all, even though they still have a brain and it's still working. And plus neurons can't think too. So it's interesting to see how it all fits together. obviously there's a huge interconnection there. It goes back to the relational thing. However, it'd be hard leap to say that the brain is the cause of consciousness. It's more connected to everything else that's going on around.
Well, then also, I'm reading it right here, and he's saying that everything we know of the brain is a product of consciousness. That is, scientifically speaking, far more certain than the consciousness itself is a product of the brain. Because it's true. It's like everything we are literally analyzing in this book is a product of consciousness. So we don't know for sure whether or not the brain is the sole cause of consciousness. Because
Actually, wait, I'll do you one better.
Okay.
Which hemisphere, pop quiz, would feel the need to have an answer to put its finger upon or to grasp the concept of consciousness?
0 points.
The left hemisphere. Because your guys are going to learn innately there is a hatred that is actually a part of the left hemisphere. And it does not not for 1 second, uncertainty, anything that is not manipulable, controllable. If you would like to sum up a philosophy, at some point you'll see power and utility is its ultimate function in the world. And it's a necessary function, but it shouldn't be the primary function, hence emissary, right? But the fact that we even get scholars and people caught in the weeds. I've literally watched some of the most intelligent people that I'm humbled to be just even on a call with them. And it's like, I'll watch them spin their tires and run around in a circle. All of their left hemisphere is pinging about how to solve a problem. And you'll find yourself going, wow, like nobody made any progress on something that actually has an irrelevance to the philosophy that was being presented. Because the right hemisphere couldn't give two shits about consciousness because it just is, and it knows it as just is, and it functions with it as just is. That type of interpretation is it's a cataloging, right? So it doesn't mean that the question isn't valid and we should never not continue the pursuit thereof, because you can never really stay in one place at the same time anyway. But when we find ourselves getting caught, you'll realize that you're caught because the left hemisphere made the world stop to bring something into focus. Now, this might be necessary, but once that has gotten as far as it can go, it needs to be relinquished back to the right hemisphere. In other words, you've got to come back into I think I heard Jeremiah say, didn't get to life had happened. And Kyle gives a line that everybody, we say in this household all the time, right? Is like, yeah, life is far more important. It's like, there's a joy of being able to have all these people come together and read a book and talk and philosophize. And this to me is like the essence of continuing to negotiate and expand everything about you. But you're damn straight. Wherever it is that you are living in that lived experience, and that is up to you to navigate it with all the complexities that surround it. And this is the part where you'll when you understand that part of your brain, and how these two amazing dynamics, and then all the other layers, right? There's so much to this. Then you'll find yourself going, oh, okay, so the fact that I feel like I even feel this conviction that I need to know this thing, this is my left hemisphere trying to get a solid map. It's looking for the, in cartography, I'm not exactly sure the name of the northeast, west, south emblem, but it's like, that's what it's trying to do. And yet your lived experience is, I just got to go that way over there, because you maybe it's somewhere you've been familiar with personally, you just haven't written it down on the map. And that's the difference, is when you start to get caught in the weeds of even your own philosophy, you might find yourself going, which hemisphere is actually driving this agenda? I could find myself getting stuck in the weeds on something. And it's a handy little tool to bear in mind when you're starting to go into philosophy, because you'll find a lot of the times you're going to get your tires spinning and you don't realize which hemisphere was asking the question.
And at the end of the day, you realize the more you know, the more you don't know. I think it was something Plato that said, it's like, the wisest man is the one who realizes he knows the least. and you realize, how fearfully and wonderfully made we are, how the brain works, how the mind works. So obviously that part of your soul. And then that is not taking into account anything else. I mean, the spiritual, your spirit as well, because it's like, well, where is this consciousness originating from? Like, if it's not created by the mind, or if it's kind of emanating, or not emanating, but if it's not from there, it's like, where does it come from? And it comes from all the, that begs the question, where is this coming from? We can kind of navigate how our brain works, but there's some questions that still can't be answered. So it's pretty interesting how that ends up playing out. How you realize that there's things that just almost questions that cannot be answered.
I think it's because the answers are moving. Like, if you look at all life is moving. So why wouldn't answers to questions regarding life also be moving? The answers are being created as we move. So I think that's part of the reason why we don't get those answers, is because they're not static. They're supposed to evolve in relation to us experiencing it. So it's not like there is a finite answer. It is a moving answer. Therefore, you'll only get parts of it. Hence, the less you know, the more you know. And I think that's whenever we learn more and we make the statement, I know so little and I know very little about life, we still in that statement feel closer, whatever that means, to what life is. And I think that's because life is that uncertain aspect. It is the unknown. It is the constant growing and expanding, the moving process. And I think that's why we understand it. I mean, the right hemisphere understands it anyway. The left, not so much, but hey.
So you said, the answer's kind of moving. It's kind of this transient thing, or maybe not transient, but kind of just this, it's not this quasi-stationary. It's kind of this, ever moving thing. What would that, what would be an example of something, or maybe not, maybe it can't be, analogous to anything, but what do you mean by that? If I could ask the question.
No examples at all. We're not allowed.
Well, I mean, the example is everything that we've already experienced. I mean, you look at life as it is, just the process of being, existing, that is a moving thing. All of us live in relation to who we are now, the people around us, also in relation to the people that lived before us and the ancestors and all of that. And we'll also be living in relation to people that haven't come yet. It's like, hence time, according to the left hemisphere, is a measurement, seconds, hours, days, etc. But time isn't a measurement according to the right hemisphere. Time is a process. A good analogy that we usually make is the ladder, the spiral ladder. Rather than a ladder just going up, it spirals through time, because you end up over top of the point that another person was at in their history, but it's still not the same point because you're further down or further in. And so that answer being the moving thing is the process of existence, the nature of all things, the nature of life, the reality, the being. It's a process. And I think that's where all true answers are. Hence, even at the beginning, the first screenshot you showed, Jeremiah, was him alluding to naive realism and scientific materialism.
Scientific materialism, yeah.
Yes, and at the same time, it is neither of them as well it is both of them, because it's the process of going in between them. Because Carter alluded a third thing altogether. That third thing is encompassing both those things. That's why it's a process. The answer is a moving thing, just as time is, just as reality in life is, because it's going from, when people say it's not black or white, it's gray, they think they've solved it because gray encompasses both black and white. But gray is still its own thing. It is its own thing, but the process of going from black to white and back to black, that is how life ends up playing out. is the moving thing that we don't have a word for. That's why all the answers are so hard to grasp, is because life itself is not graspable, because life itself is moving. Reality, God, the truth. It's this moving thing. It's moved, hence the betweenness of things, because we are all in relation to one another, between one another, just as the answers to all of it will be between one another.
A nice way to understand it that I've seen before is in the Divine Liturgy, which is Eastern Catholic or Orthodox. They describe God as always changing and ever the same. And I think that's a nice way to put it for reality too. There's timeless truths and realities that are unchanging across what we perceive as time and space. But we understand those realities in a ever-changing context too. So both two things can be true at the same time. Things can be constant and also in flux, both at the same time.
I think it's a manifestation. Like, to think of what Maddie said, I think of when I think of time, I kind of think of like cycles, because even if you look at the solar system, they have their own cycles that they go through actually. And it made me think of time, and it made me think of, okay, so if we went back to the medieval period versus now, is it one of those things where chronologically it was this all the way to this? And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think it's more so like a cycle, and like a circle, there's no start and there's no end. It's just it's a continuation. And I think that when it comes to these patterns that I guess my dad was alluding to, and when it comes to things like I don't know, morality or things that we would define as like objective truths, I think that it's always a discovering and rediscovering when it comes to the human disposition, because we have brains essentially that do this thing where they're trying to figure out this interpretation of what is happening, what am I actually living in. And I think that it's interesting, because even a part of it in the book where he's like saying even our understanding of the brain's ways of understanding alters our understanding of the brain itself. And so to me, how I would view that is even almost like, again, even if you think that there's a way to box things in, like this is the way it is, there's context surrounding how you even got to that statement in the first place, and there's context that is going to continue to surround it farther from where you expand upon the initial statement. And it's even one of those things where even us trying to analyze the brain, I feel like it was a really humble way when Iain put this into the book, because it's almost as simple as him also saying, and even my understanding of the way that I understand the brains is going to alter actually my understanding of the brain, because I can't pinpoint it, because I'm working with my understanding, and that's of something that I'm living in. So it's like it's a changing thing, but it's also it's not concrete to the point where you can ping it down, like point it down and bring it to this finite conclusion. So yeah.
He gives a lot of historical evidence that you guys will really enjoy for those who are history lovers later on in the book. Because once again, he sets nomeological evidence for so many facets and dynamics of just our existence, even though we categorize things like, history and music and culture. And so we put these labels on these things that we've experienced and we've cultivated over the years in our own evolution as coexisting people who are loving and hating one another throughout all of our existence. And that ends up being, it's interesting when the evidence gets presented that we've gotten, like, I would say on a spiritual level, I would consider my sojourn towards God as a chaser, because I believe I've been one my whole existence, even at times when I didn't think I was doing that thing. What is interesting is I'm sitting here and I'm seeing a bunch of young minds who I remember when my kids first discovered a ball. Okay. So here's one for you. The ball existed before any of my kids encountered a ball for the first time. How did I know this? I'm the one that presented them the ball. So I got the ball first. So this thing existed well before it ever meant anything to my children. And this is the unique perspective that, as someone who's now further down that spiral that Macy was talking about, a continual cycle, is that I get to reflect on more to bring more context to the consciousness of someone that I am in negotiation with. Now, when you're negotiating with a baby, as someday you guys will all discover, you got very little wiggle room because the communication barriers, but you do your best, and then they get the ball, and then you watch this, like, it's like this thing just to materialize out of fucking nowhere, if you'll forgive my say so. And then the looks on their faces, and they go and they do this thing. But there's this inspiration, there's this they're enamored, and it's like, this is solely what I believe, that it's that childlike state that allows for the continual pursuit. Because even when I was doing Bible studies, and I'd take the Bible and we'd go over, like, read it, and like I said, it's a book I consumed a lot, more than any other book I've ever consumed. And one of the most controversial scenarios that I ever found myself in is I walked in and I said, we are making a mistake by thinking that this book is the living word. And I said, it's not, it's a book. And I threw it on the floor. And I said, every time your attention as a person comes to this book, it is that which you have brought with your mode of attention of reading this, and then thinking on it, pondering on it, demonstrating, talking. This is all negotiation, by the way, all the things I'm listing. And it's like, these that's the essence, the drawing. Like, the left hemisphere would give you literature that is stasis for you to ponder and contemplate. But then it's kind of like the church getting smashed, and everybody, like, when the 12 disciples all they buggered off to go and do their thing. It's like, there is no movement of community when it's in stasis. And a book is what brings community ideas, but it puts it in stasis. So then it's like having a theory or a formula of community. You still need to have this lived thing in order to go, oh, that's why that makes sense. Because I've gone back to some of the Gospels, and it's like, you find yourself going, oh man, when I read this in context, this makes far more sense than it did the first time I read it. So it's the same thing. The kid gets the ball. It existed before the kid ever knew that it was a ball. I knew there was a ball. Somebody introduced the ball to me. Now, I had done a bunch of things with the ball that nobody had ever done before. And my kids, they eventually did things with the ball that I did before, but now they're doing some different things with the ball because they had their own creative way and I got involved in it. And all this to say is that that's the temptation. The temptation the left hemisphere will always offer you is to get your certainty and assuredness that you know where you are in that spiral. And the right hemisphere goes, yeah, but you're not there anymore. And it'll as fast as the left hemisphere goes, I got it. No, you don't. You had it. Like, the minute I got it, but that's it. The right hemisphere's like, yeah, but you had it. You don't have it anymore. Now there's going to be something more to add to this. And that's why it's the footsteps. Everybody who has a believing background, if you haven't, I encourage, it's great. Author unknown poem, but the footsteps is a pursuit thing. It's movement. And this is where you champion faith. This is where no matter what happens, you can come up with your philosophical, pick your what do they call all those things? Those platonic shapes. Pick your platonic shape and stuff your philosophy in it. Fair enough. You've done this thing. You've created a book because you stuffed it in it. But everything that makes that relevant is outside of it. So both things are fantastic when they work in tandem with one another, but they have to stay expanding, because no matter what, it's always outside. Like, the truth is always outside. And I don't mean this as an anatomical, because you have to resonate with it to a certain degree. But that's the part about the hemisphere chase. I have found myself more enamored in my faith and more in awe, which is a right hemisphere emotion, by going through this work. Because it makes literature about every stitch or hair on your head, you know, the flowers of the field, the birds of the air, like they do not sow, they do not reap. It's like when you consider the things that just are and they just do, and then you realize that those two hemispheres were planned some way, somehow, that is far beyond what I am capable of completely getting a grasp on. But I'm going to continue trying to get a grasp because I have no choice. I have a left hemisphere. It's going to do this thing. And where I will excel in that chase is trying not to make sure I put the people that I'm negotiating with, such as all of you or my family and other people, and thinking, well, then this is where you got to be in order for us to be able to negotiate God. And it's like, yeah, that's not really a good idea, because that's you putting him in a ball, and you have no idea what you're capable of doing with that ball, not just by yourself, but with others, if you can get past the structure. And I think that because the right hemisphere doesn't have a structure for God. And there's more evidence to show of this as you continue with this literature, especially if you guys ever decide you want to take on the other two tomes that he's got beyond, because this book was in 2009. I'm working through them right now, and it's phenomenally, I'm excited for one day you guys decide you want to tangle with it. But anyways, yeah, sorry for that long enamored rant, but I feel like it plays into it.
Yeah, he's doing the matter with things, which there's two parts, and he reads them at the table in the morning, and then there will be certain parts where he laughs, where he goes, "Oh," and we're like, "Okay, share with the class, what is it?" And one of the things that he shared was it this morning or yesterday, was the right hemisphere. The corpus callosum being the inhibitor is because, like just Ed alluded to, that there's no structure for the right hemisphere. Although it may be the master, or ought to be the master anyway, it still knows it needs the left hemisphere, because unhinged, it can't do anything. It is overwhelmed with everything, just what life is, experience. It takes everything into context, which means it can't think. It can't even look at something specific. It can't focus on a human being's face because it's taking into the space and the body of the person. It's like you couldn't do anything practically in real life because you're taking in absolutely everything around you at all times. Whereas the left hemisphere, it doesn't get any of that. It won't acknowledge that there is anything outside of what it sees. So it's that the inhibitory factor is like, not only to the corpus callosum helps them communicate with one another, because the right hemisphere understands it needs the left in order to bring the world about in a way that we can actually function in it. But it also does the inhibitory thing because it understands too much of one or the other, and you lose your functionability in the world. You lose the ability to work with one another because we're all in relation to one another. It's not just ourselves. It's me with Macy, me with Cyril, and all of that jazz. And so it's funny because even Dad going through the matter with things, when I first read this book, I thought, I don't need to do it again. Like, it's a 24-hour audiobook. I'm like, I don't want to go through it again. It'll take me too long. But now we're doing it. We got through the first 30 pages relatively quickly. Like, it only took me a week. Carter was like, you can get through 5 pages a day. That's easy peasy. And he was right. But still, with all the context that we're learning, and I understand the hemispheres better because of all the religious context Dad brings in about God. And then I also get it better as he reads more about the matter with things, which is talking about like the nature of reality as well as the brains. It relates to everything because everything is in relation.
And I think that's interesting. Like you were saying there, Mike. I think there was, there's definitely some truth to that because, it's like you were talking about scripture. I think it was Paul that said, the spirit without the law, or no, sorry, the life, the journey without the law is death, or with only the law without the spirit is death to every man. But without the law and just the spirit, there's no transgression. So that's the point. It's like kind of interesting because then like there is no truth. So it's kind of that mixture of both where you kind of like you were saying, you're not putting it into a box of necessarily how you understand it and this is the way things are. There's kind of that there's that movement of things that are not completely in stasis. There are some things that definitely are, but I thought that was definitely interesting because kind of just that does expand the ways we think of things in the world around us. But
the fulfillment of the law was a demonstration by the Son, right? Like when Paul was making that, if I'm not mistaken, that address was in Ephesians or Thessalonians or something there, because what he was trying to do is like kind of like the everybody familiar with the term, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good, or you're so earthly minded, you're no heavenly good. And so Jesus kind of helped people flip the script on this whole dynamic and be like, I will show you the way. Yeah, everybody knows that meme. And it's like his demonstration, for in as much as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are left hemisphere philosopher thinkers, by the way, their point of fact was, but you're not obeying the rules, and these rules were set into motion. And what was being offered was the right hemisphere's philosopher, and that is, no, you're not understanding how to demonstrate them. Like, you've put them into poignant aspects. Well, that's the left hemisphere's philosophy. It does bureaucracy. It writes stuff down on scrolls and says, see, holds up the piece of paper and goes, this is what you're supposed to do. Well, because that creates certainty. Why did they not like Jesus? Because he was doing things that made all of their world uncertain, because he was doing things like forgiving people and moving forward in relationships, and he understood scriptures and yet would demonstrate something and they'd be like, but that contradicts scriptures. And he's like, actually, no, it fulfills it, which means that we have a mode of attention, left hemisphere, that's locking on to how it thinks one should operate in the world. And I'm going to demonstrate the law. The law has its place, but a new covenant I bring you. Well, why would you need a new one if you're not going to do away with the old one? Doesn't mean that the old one didn't have its value, but essentially Jesus was a progressive. Like, I know that would be sacrilegious to some if they actually would consider it, but by physical demonstration, you were getting the right hemisphere pinging the update that the left hemisphere so badly needs, because you will let your love of the pursuit of that which one will call God become stagnant because of how badly the left hemisphere can't understand God. It's not a matter of won't. It can get that type of obstinate, but it actually can't. That's other literature for a later time and more discussion on that. Because when you start getting into the colostomy part of the literature that you guys will come to, where the split brain process, because that's how they dealt with epilepsy at one point in time in our history. They literally just cut the corpus callosum. And when you start to see how we, like all human beings, function without having the inhibitor or the pinging that's necessary between the relationship of the two hemispheres play out in the manifest in the real world, this is where you'll start to find the pattern, and you'll be like, oh wow, like this is why Stalin thought that way. This is why the oligarchs are doing their thing right now in this world. This is why the British Empire's philosophy is playing out this way. Oh, this makes sense about this person's living demonstration. Like, here's one. Why did Plato write down everything for Socrates? Socrates didn't write a damn thing down. I can answer that question. It's right here. It's in the brain. There's a reason why it didn't happen that way. And when you get through that, you find yourself going, well, damn, I really do have an angel and a devil on my shoulders at all time. That's a part of my interpretive attention of consciousness, called the right and left hemisphere. And it's manifesting all the time. So it's pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, like this would open up an entirely not really different can of worms. It's in relation, obviously, so not really, but when I think of the right and left hemisphere, and when it comes to trying to understand the world that we're in, the left hemisphere will, as Mike described, put it into a book. Pick your philosophy and shove it into a thing, and then boom, you got it, when you really don't got it. Because it's almost like, and it's an analogy that really helps, is like when you're looking at a apple tree, and it starts off as a seed, and then it goes to a sprout, and then it goes to a tree, and then it goes to something that produces fruit. It's like, at what point was it not still just an apple tree? Like, you called it this seed, this bud, this, according to different stages of stasis that the left hemisphere needed to categorize it, but it was still a moving process. It's like me, and all of us, like, we started off as little wee babies, but we're still the essence of us. Like, it's still us. It just, we categorize it in different stages. And I think that's why even when it comes to, I guess, when we're going down the idea of a first cause, and why, like, how did it all start? It's like only the left hemisphere would look for it to be a starting point. It would look for, where's the seed? It must have started at the seed. And it's like, well, did it? Because surrounding the seed was this sunlight and this water and this soil. And then what is the seed comprised of? And also just, but it's not necessarily just it by itself, because again, it relies on everything around it in order to be what it is. It's like, I relied on all the minds of the people that I'm surrounded with and the experience that I am living, in conjunction with sunlight hitting my skin, with just the chair I'm sitting on, everything, like, and all of it plays into what I am. And so I may have an essence that's uniquely and individually mine, but there's context surrounding, well, all of us individually. So it's no different than when people are like, well, there had to be a first cause, or like God did this thing. It's like, well, what was the context surrounding God? Like, who made him? You know what I mean? It's like there's more, and and I feel like the reason why this resonates is because there's always an expansion. There's always in order for us to be co-creators, in order for anything to be created, there has to be more. So it's like, in order to expand upon something, there had to be more to expand upon. So it's like, again, it comes back to that cycle thing, and the left is uncomfortable with that, because it's like, well, I don't like the idea of not having a justification for why it is I do the things I do. But whereas the right hemisphere just understands, but this is just what we do in relation to what's going on. It's like, whether you like it or not, this is what is happening. Like, and so that's my 2 bits.
And that opens a whole nother can of worms, where, you've got, like Mike was saying, you've kind of got that angel and the demon within. Even scripture, I think, acknowledges that the heart is desperately wicked, and the heart is definitely a part of the soul, which is mind, will, and emotions. It's kind of all that jazz. But then you also have to, that is not at all taking, so that throws a wrench into things, and our understanding of things is external evil. And that good and evil, we know good and evil, you have to have some sort of premise of good and evil before you start questioning everything, because the next thing you could fall into that pit of relativism. But it's kind of interesting, because then you look at that, you acknowledge the fact that, if there's good, there must be an opposite, evil. And how does that factor into decision making, how you're being affected by how is that affecting your experiences, and what your observation and what's making you who you are, I guess. How is that affecting you, if that's even a thing, depending on where you're coming from. But it's kind of an interesting topic to get into another time, I guess.
What would be the problem with acknowledging the context of a first cause? Why can't we say there is a first cause? God exists in relation to us as the first cause, and we exist in relation to God. Where's the lack of?
There's no evidence of it in all of God's creation. This is a little bit of a problem. When you actually start to look at the harmonics of the universe, you start to look at platonic solids, you start to look at the cell structure, you start to look at the flash of energy when a sperm cell and an egg cell meet, the fact that there is memory and continuation, there's a continuum of all things, always, at all times. So only the left hemisphere requires the beginning. And the beginning is a finite. But you actually can't have a beginning without something before it. The term beginning means nothing if there wasn't something before it. So one of the things that I would offer is understanding that this is very important to the left hemisphere to have that, because it works. You guys are going to learn this. There's more to this. So we're getting a little bit further than what will also help play into this. Like this question does get answered when you understand which hemisphere, once again, is asking the question or desiring that philosophical outcome. And then once you start understanding that, you find yourself going, okay, I'm not opposed to ever learning that there could be a beginning. But I also instinctively understand that that will never be, because it always was. In other words, it's like the ball thing. I bought the ball to my kids. Someone brought a ball to me. I don't know how many of us came before the collective us, but there's always been somebody bringing the ball to the kid to do the thing. This evolution has a long-standing history, but it really means nothing in the cycle scheme. And when you do look at all these, like everything, and your best scientists were trying to reconcile God to science. They're busy finding these things that we go, oh, there's some objective truths here, and we function and live with it. We're literally living in the reality of it. And they kept that playful humility in pursuit of God. Then you had this group of individuals, once again, very strong in left hemisphere philosophy, that tried to remove God out of science. And this is a mistake, I believe, wholeheartedly. And so when you start to understand which hemisphere is at play, you start to understand the questions that come up and what is it that you're looking for. Because if you find that you're having some uncertainty about the axioms that you're standing on when they get challenged, that's nothing to be afraid of. So what is it about an individual? What is it about a person's disposition when they think that they need to defend God to the death, when they think that they need to structure something that which is in structure? There's a reason why the vision of God was barely the backside for the ancient prophet. You don't get to see God, but yet if you look closely or even openly, God's everywhere. That was truly the moral of that little function. That was, let me put my hand to protect you as I pass you by. That's life. That little metaphor in the Bible, that was life. Let me protect you, but it's passing you by. Because you've asked for this sign. You've decided to make God stop for your left hemisphere's satisfaction. And that is where the need for the beginning comes from.
Yeah, it's like the Big Bang. I mean, the Big Bang is the idea that the world just poof became. It's like, so you're saying that everything we know today, something came out of nothing? It just started. It's like, no, then you're saying something came out of nothing, but something is not nothing. And that's what God isn't this Big Bang that just was nothing and now it's something. God has always been something. And if it's always something, it's always been. It's always moved. It's always been this process. It's always manifested. And you can't manifest from nothing.
Yeah, I think we're saying somewhat similar things in that it's not a deistic understanding of the world that God set everything into motion and then let it go. God is existence, and as such, he is the first cause of that, and we participate in that existence to whatever degree. We don't have to have a mechanistic understanding of first cause. We have to acknowledge that there are things here, and they weren't here before, and they come into being and they pass out of being. So if they're passing in and out of being, then what is being? It's what originated it all.
Yeah. I could propose an analogy, I think it would be, I've heard of this before, like a thought experiment. It's, if you're, let's say, it's kind of acknowledging the fact that there's other dimensions for sure. You you look at mathematics and technically there's infinite dimensions by even, you have three variables in an equation. You have X, Y, and Z. You have three dimensions. If you have four variables, then you have four dimensions. So you can analyze it just with simple math. Well, not so simple, but but you look at it and you know, we see something in our world. We try to understand things that are beyond us. We're taking our consciousness and we're trying to analyze, well, what is the beginning of that consciousness? And it's kind of like, the servant, or it's not the servant, but it's the lower rank trying to understand the purposes of the higher ranking being, which is in most cases, or not in most cases, it is impossible. If you look at, let's say we were stick men on a drawing effort that does this thought experiment. If we were, let's say, we're operating in third dimension and we see this world of stick men on a piece of paper and they're living their life, and then you stick your finger on the paper and yet they have no idea, they can't see into the third dimension. So what they would see was just a circle with a gray shading, probably the center, because it's the shade of your finger on the paper. So that would be their small observation of what truly is in the third dimension, which we understand, but yet that world has no clue of what is going on. They can only see that very small window of what actually is going on. And I would say that's analogous to in this case, we look at things and we try to ask questions, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that's actually really healthy, to have a healthy sense of suspicion and questioning. And yet we also acknowledge the fact that there's some questions that, I don't think they'll be forever unanswered, but at least in this setting that we are right now, in this in the third dimension, they're for sure unanswered, or impossible to understand with the carnal mind, I would say.
Yeah. It's like saying the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's not a wrong thing to say, based on the fact that we're here on Earth and we can observe it. But it doesn't capture the fullness of the story either, because obviously the Earth rotates around the sun. We figured that out. And there's even more to it, how that came to be, how that orbit came to be. The same thing is true with saying God is a first cause. You can't say that and stop there. It doesn't capture the fullness of the story. At the same time, it's not incorrect to say it either. Everything came from somewhere and passes into being and passes out of being. And to acknowledge an origin isn't to deny context or to put things in stasis.
No, and I wasn't even implying that. What I'm saying is that it's incomplete. Just like I had said earlier in the conversation, is that when an individual gets stuck, that's an incomplete analysis. Of course, I would agree with it, but I would be like, there's another fun little scripture. It's like, now I know in part, yet I am fully known, and then I shall know fully. This also plays into when I was a child, I thought I was a child. I spake as a child. When I became a man, I left childish ways behind me. Those are all movement. And so this is where the most truth lies, because where you guys were all as children, and some, I watched that journey from start to now. And then for the rest of you, I haven't, but I know that happened. By faith, I know that happened, but I didn't watch you do it. But I'm going to infer it because you're sitting here as adults now. So it's like, okay, so now you're in this place, but I know damn well what you thought and you knew of the world back then was nothing in contrast to what you know now. But in context, it's going to be nothing in comparison to what you will know, even just by adding another book into your lexicon of life. This is a stasis thing, this book, but all the stuff that we're doing right now exemplifies it and unpacks it. Right? Which means it's putting it out into an open lived experience. So I would sit back and say, if we will ever come to find ourselves with an origin story, it will be that childlike curiosity to say, why is the sky blue? Where did the stars come from? Like, man, I got bombarded by questions. I mean, if you think that you need to know stuff, wait till you become parents, because you're going to need to know things in areas that you didn't even think of when a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old start doing that. And what's happening is they're having some frontal lobe development. That's why they do this thing. And you'll get it. That's another cool part of the brain in its developmental process. And it's like, so that's where I would sit back and say, yeah, I don't disagree with your statement of that earlier mention. I just know that is incomplete. And I would not want to leave that in the hands of the emissary, because then you end up with an ideologue. And it's like, don't do that thing. You'll actually turn God into a sphinx. God is not a sphinx.
Suppose we can do one last round of questions if anybody has anything. Or Cyril, do you feel like you understand a bit more of the overall, like with some of the discussion that has happened here? Maybe not specific parts, but do you feel like you get the point of the introduction that maybe you didn't get before?
A little bit, yeah. Not much. To be honest, I've already forgotten the first chapter and the introduction. Like, it's probably a really bad thing, but I don't even remember what I read like 2 hours ago when I was trying to catch up with the end of the chapter because I was procrastinating it. And yeah, so the discussion definitely helps to clear up some of the stuff and to actually learn a bit, because to be honest, I didn't really get much from the actual reading of it.
What about some of the screenshots brought up today? Did the screenshots that we talked about make sense?
Yeah, it made sense. I remembered that I remembered that I read that, but I forgot all the context about it.
That's awesome. We're only going to expand upon that context as we continue through.
I was gonna say, and also the fucking hilarious part, pardon my French, but the fucking hilarious part about doing this is the fact that it's like, okay, so like Cyril, you're like 16 years old trying to figure out this tomb. I'm 19 trying to figure it out. Dad's a 40-something-year-old man trying to figure it out. It's like it never stops. So you're all good, bro. Like the fact that you showed up, you're doing well.
It's what I even love about returning to works you've already consumed and watched. Like, you listen to a song when you're 10 years old, you listen to the same song when you're 25 years old. The thing means something completely different. Same with movies, same with books. So it's like when Mike was talking about the book not being the living word of God, it's because a younger version of you reading that book and an older version of you reading that book, you're going to get completely different things each time you read it as you get smarter and you exist in this process. And that's like the thing that keeps everything exciting all the time if you let it be, because there's always something more to learn, even from something that you've done 100 times.
And I think it says in Psalms that it says the word of the Lord is it's like fine silver purified 7 times through the fire. And that, from my understanding at least, means could mean several interpretations, which just goes to show that the profundity of something of that goes to show that it is, it's a living work. It's not really something that's in stasis, because you come back at it and you keep looking at it and you realize it's something that continues on, and it kind of never ends. And it's interesting because this conversation, at the end of the day, it addresses, well, what is life, but also addresses, what is the purpose of life as well. That's a topic for another time, but it's pretty cool because that's in the end, that is what everyone is seeking. What is their purpose, and they either create that or they have they're told of what their purpose is. And we're seeing that from governments. It's like, no, this is who you're going to be, this is what you're going to do. You're a serf, or you're a slave, or you're going to die. So that's kind of what we see.
Well, I think to close it off, I got a pretty good last screenshot, which kind of encompasses that really nice recap, Jeremiah. So we will make this the last share. If I click the right one. Everybody can see?
Barely,
Okay.
it's really tiny. Can you, which page are you reading on? 28?
28.
Okay.
I think. Yeah, this is not the, yeah, it's not the weird PDF 50 pages. That's 28.
Okay,
Everybody good?
sure.
Okay. Understanding the brain. This leads to a fundamental point about any attempt to understand the brain. It is a particularly acute case of the problems encountered in understanding anything. The nature of the attention one brings to bear on anything alters what you find. What we aim to understand changes its nature with the context in which it lies, and we can only ever understand anything as a something. There's no way around these problems, if they are problems. To attempt to detach oneself entirely is just to bring a special kind of attention to bear, which will have important consequences for what we find. Similarly, we cannot see something without there being a context, even if the context appears to be that of no context, a thing ripped free of its moorings in the lived world. That is just a special, highly value-laden kind of context in itself, and it certainly alters what we find too. Nor can we say that we do not see things as anything at all, that we just see them, full stop. There's always a model by which we are understanding, an exemplar with which we are comparing what we see, and where it is not identified it usually means that we have tacitly adopted the model of the machine. Does that mean that all attempts to approach truth, other than to say everything has its truth in its own way, are doomed? That every version of reality has equal value? Certainly not. I will explore these issues later, as they are central to this book.
I like it.
Awesome sauce. Okay, thanks everybody.
He'd be impressed
Yeah.
that people of this demographic are trying to actually understand the brain. If anything, hopefully he does see it. Maybe we can get an interview.
Haha. Okay,
Alrighty,
thank you.
ciao.
Yeah,
Bye,
take care,
guys.
guys. Yeah, thanks.
Bye.